All right, so we're back for another deep dive, and this time we're staying pretty local.
Mm?
We're heading over to West Vancouver.
Beautiful West Van.
Yeah, and we've talked about laneway homes a lot on the show,
Yeah.
and people are always asking for more
Yeah,
specifics.
for sure.
So we're going to do that today. We're going to look at West Vancouver specifically.
Okay.
And you've been poring over all of their guidelines on laneway homes, and we're
Right.
kind of going beyond just like the general stuff that everyone knows about laneway homes. We're talking about like, okay, if you're thinking about putting a laneway home in for family in West Van,
Yes.
or if you're looking at it as like an investment opportunity,
Interesting.
what do you really need to know? So that's kind of our mission today.
Yeah, that makes sense because I think West Van has, a unique approach and guidelines that are specific to their
For
community.
sure. For sure. Okay, so let's just get right into it. According to West Vancouver, like, what are laneway homes?
Well, it's interesting. They sometimes refer to them as coach houses or garden suites.
Okay.
But, the guidelines really define them as a way to kind of like regenerate these single family neighborhoods without like significantly changing their character.
Right.
That's a big thing. It's about kind of keeping that.
Yeah, they don't want to just transform everything.
Exactly. It's more subtle.
Right.
They lay out, a bunch of different benefits to this approach.
Yeah, they do. It's a long list.
Yeah, it is. And, some of the key ones are definitely like providing rental opportunities.
Right, which is obviously huge for investors.
Huge. Yeah.
But they also talk a lot about, multi-generational family housing.
Yeah. And that's something that's becoming more and more important, these days.
For sure.
And it's a way to provide more affordable options.
Yeah.
And more efficient use of existing infrastructure.
All right.
So there's all these benefits like, even increased safety and beautification of lanes. They talk about revitalization.
They really thought of everything.
They have. It's a pretty comprehensive set of goals.
Okay, so let's say you're thinking, okay, I want to build a laneway home on my property. I want to have, mom and dad move in, or the kids are getting older and they need their own space.
Right.
How do West Van's guidelines like support that?
So right off the bat, one thing that really stands out is this idea of putting the laneway home at the rear of the property.
Okay.
Which makes a lot of sense, right? Because you're kind of like close to the main house, but you still have that separation.
Not on top of each other.
Exactly. And that's really important for multi-generational living. You need that balance.
For sure. For sure. And, even thinking about like, they talk about this idea of, being a good neighbor.
Yes.
And I was thinking about that, and it's like, well, that's even more important.
Oh, yeah.
When the neighbor is your family.
Absolutely. Because you're going to be seeing them all the time.
Exactly. So how do they...
So they really stress the importance of minimizing any impact on like neighboring properties.
Okay.
And so that means, things like window placement.
Right.
You don't want to be staring into your parents' bedroom.
Exactly. Or like they're looking into your kitchen while you're trying to make dinner.
And then even just the size and shape of the laneway home, like they call it building massing.
Okay.
And just thinking about like shadows.
Right.
Making sure that it's not casting a huge shadow on the main house or the other way around.
So it's really about like harmony.
Exactly. Yeah. Keeping that harmony within the family and
Right.
with the neighbors.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Now, we've talked about having, the parents move in or maybe older kids.
Yeah.
What about accessibility? Because that can be a big concern.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And the guidelines are actually really good on this.
Okay.
They actually encourage the design of fully accessible laneway homes.
Wow.
Which is great. And they even talk about the possibility of getting what they call zoning variances
Okay.
to build like single-story accessible units.
That's awesome.
Yeah, because, maybe there's some, restrictions on height or whatever.
Right.
But if you need to build a single story for accessibility reasons, you can apply for that variance.
So they're really thinking about people with mobility challenges.
Absolutely. And not just that, but it also just like increases the flexibility
Yeah.
of the laneway home in the long term.
That's a good point.
Because, if you decide to sell it later on,
Yeah.
it's going to appeal to a wider range of buyers or renters.
That's really smart. Okay, so you're thinking about the future too.
Yeah.
Thinking about, if you do want to sell it down the road.
Exactly.
That's a good thing to keep in mind. Okay, so we've talked about accessibility.
Yeah.
What about like private outdoor space? Because, you're talking about having family live there. They probably don't want to be.
Yeah, you don't want to be sharing a patio.
Exactly.
Right. So that's actually a requirement in the guidelines.
Okay.
They require a separate, accessible, ground level, private outdoor area
Okay.
for the laneway home. and that's separate from the main house's yard.
Okay, so it's like their own little space.
Exactly. And that's really important for that sense of independent living.
Yeah.
Even when you're close to family,
Right.
you still have your own space.
Okay, let's talk about parking because,
Oof, the dreaded parking.
yeah, it's not the most fun thing to talk about, but
Yeah.
in West Van especially, it can be a challenge.
It can be a challenge.
So,
So the guidelines generally allow for only one driveway access
okay,
per property,
okay.
which means, families need to think carefully about how they're going to manage parking
For both places.
for the main house and the laneway home.
Yeah,
Now, here's an interesting thing. If you're within 400 meters
okay,
of a bus stop,
okay.
West Van doesn't require any off-street parking for the laneway home.
Interesting.
Yeah, so if you're close to transit,
Okay.
you're good to go.
So that's something to think about for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. But, if you are further away from transit, there are other options.
Okay.
You can have a surface parking spot.
Right.
You could have an enclosed garage that's integrated into the laneway home.
Okay.
Or even, a designated parking spot in the main house's garage.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah, just share the space.
Yeah, for sure.
So there's options.
That makes sense. Okay, so we've kind of looked at it from the family perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Let's switch gears a little bit and think about it from the investor's point of view.
All right.
So what do these same guidelines, how do they look to someone who's saying, maybe I should build a laneway home and rent it out?
Well, the first thing that jumps out is that they explicitly mention providing rental opportunities.
Right.
Which is obviously, a major draw for investors.
Right.
That's often the primary goal.
Yeah.
And beyond that, the whole concept of a laneway home allows you to use your land more efficiently.
Right.
You're getting more bang for your buck, essentially.
Yeah, you're making more use of that
Exactly.
space that's already there.
And that can potentially lead to, a better return on investment.
Yeah.
Compared to just having the single-family home.
Right. And do you know they specifically mention potential supplemental income?
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Right.
A well-designed, well-located laneway home
Yeah.
can bring in consistent rental income, which you can use to, offset your mortgage costs.
Right.
Or just have some extra financial flexibility.
Yeah, exactly. And they also talk about, using high-quality materials and good design.
Yes.
Which, maybe seems like a bigger investment up front, but it's
Right.
about that long-term value.
Exactly. Yeah, you're thinking long-term.
Right.
It's going to appeal to better tenants.
Yeah, for sure.
If you have a really nice laneway home.
Right. And then it's going to be worth more when you sell it, too.
Exactly.
So you're kind of winning on all fronts.
Exactly. Yeah, you got to think long-term.
Okay, so there's this idea of lane treatment,
Yeah.
which is a little strange.
I know it sounds a bit odd.
But basically it's like, landscaping and lighting. And I
Yeah.
was like, okay, what does that have to do with investing?
Right. Well, it's all about a curb appeal, right?
Yeah.
But in this case, it's lane appeal.
Lane appeal. I like that.
Yeah, you want to create this, inviting atmosphere,
right.
having nice landscaping,
Yeah.
good lighting. It just makes the whole property look more attractive.
Makes it feel safer, too.
Exactly, yeah, and that attracts better tenants.
Yeah.
It can also, contribute to the property value in the long run.
That's a good point. Okay, what about the garage? Because they talk about minimizing the look of the garage.
Yes.
So how does that...
So it's kind of like they want to emphasize the residential living space
Okay.
of the laneway home. They don't want it to just feel like a garage with a little apartment attached.
Right.
They want it to feel like a proper home.
A real home.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's going to attract tenants who are looking for a place to live.
Right. Not just a place to park their car.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so, we've been talking about family investors. It seems like there's some, core design considerations
Definitely.
that apply to both.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about those.
Okay.
The first thing they mention is respecting neighborhood character.
Yes.
Which seems pretty obvious, but what does that mean?
It means, you want to design a laneway home that fits in with the existing neighborhood.
Right.
You don't want to build something that's totally out of place.
Right.
So that means considering the architectural style,
Right.
the scale of the homes around you,
Right.
and just making sure that it's a positive addition to the community.
It's about harmony again.
Exactly. Yeah, it's all about harmony.
Yeah. Okay, and West Van, we've talked about this before, but the topography can be challenging.
Oh, yeah.
Lots of hills.
Lots of hills.
So how do they address that in the guidelines?
So they talk a lot about respecting the existing topography,
Okay.
minimizing grade alterations,
Right.
and thinking about things like sunlight and views
Right.
for both the laneway home and the main house.
Okay, so you're not totally reshaping the landscape.
Exactly. Yeah, you want to work with what's there
Right.
as much as possible.
And that makes sense, for families.
Yeah.
It's more comfortable.
Yeah.
For investors, it probably saves money
Oh, yeah,
because
absolutely.
you're not doing all this crazy excavation.
Exactly. You don't want to have to blast through a bunch of rock
Right.
to make your laneway home fit.
And views are important,
Views are always important.
especially in West Van.
Especially in West Ham. Yeah.
Okay, they also talk a lot about landscaping and sustainability.
They do.
Which is great. So what are some of the key things there?
Well, they talk a lot about, preserving mature trees,
Okay.
which is great for the environment,
Uh-huh.
using permeable paving,
Okay.
which allows rainwater to soak through,
Okay.
so you're not getting all that runoff.
Right.
And even, incorporating rainwater collection systems.
Wow. So they're really thinking about like the whole ecosystem.
They are. Yeah, they're really thinking holistically.
That's great.
And then they also talk about, choosing native plants
Okay.
that are low maintenance.
Right. So that's good for, families. They don't have to
Exactly.
spend all their time gardening.
Yeah, less work for everybody.
And for investors, it probably means lower maintenance costs.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So it's a win-win.
Yeah.
What about the look and feel of the Laneway home? Like they talk about architectural expression and materials.
Yeah, they're pretty specific about that.
Okay.
They really advocate for a clear design approach
Okay.
using high-quality, durable materials.
Right.
They actually specifically say to avoid vinyl siding.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they're not fans of vinyl siding.
Okay, so that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah. And again, it's about, for families, it's about having a home that's going to last.
Right.
And for investors, it's about, having a property that's going to hold its value.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, they also talk about the entry design.
Yes.
Like the actual entryway to the Laneway home. Why is that important?
Well, they want to make sure that the entry is oriented towards the lane
Okay.
for easy access.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And they also talk about, having proper setbacks
Okay.
so that you're not, right up against the property line.
Right.
And then things like awnings and lighting
Okay.
to make it feel more welcoming.
Yeah, it's like a little front porch.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, they want to feel like a proper home.
A real home.
Yeah.
Okay, and lastly, we've talked about privacy a little bit,
Mhm.
but it's especially important for investors
That's
because
right.
you've got renters.
Yeah, you don't want your renters looking into the neighbor's windows.
Exactly.
Right.
So what do they say about that?
So they have specific regulations about window placement.
Okay.
And the design of any balconies or decks,
Okay.
all aimed at minimizing that potential for overlooking.
Right.
And that's really important for maintaining good relationships with the neighbors
Right.
and ensuring that the renters have a sense of privacy,
Right.
which is going to make them happier.
Happier renters.
Happier renters, yeah, and more likely to stay.
Yeah, that's good for everybody.
Exactly.
Okay, so someone's listening to this and they're like, okay, this is great. I'm sold on Laneway homes in West End.
Yeah.
What should they do next?
So the first thing you absolutely have to do is contact West Vancouver's Planning and Development Department.
Okay.
They are the experts.
Yeah.
They have all the latest information.
Right.
They can answer any specific questions.
Okay.
You can reach them at 604-925-7055
Got it.
or email them at planningdepartment@westvancouver.ca.
Perfect. And we also wanted to mention a builder
Oh, yes.
that,
Who we really like.
yeah, someone we recommend.
Yes. If you're looking for a builder, we highly recommend Corval Homes.
Yeah, they do great work.
They do amazing work. They specialize in laneway homes.
Mm-hmm.
You can check out their website, corvalhomes.com.
Perfect.
And if you do reach out to them, ask for Gordy.
Okay.
He's the man. He knows his stuff.
All right, Gordy, we're sending you some business.
Yeah,
Hopefully.
hopefully.
So to wrap things up, it seems like Laneway homes in West,
Yeah,
they're a great option,
they are.
for families, for investors, but
But
there's
you got to understand the guidelines.
you've got to do your homework.
Exactly. Yeah, you can't just jump in blindly. You got to
Okay.
really understand the nuances.
Okay.
And work with the city to make sure that your project
Yeah.
is going to be successful.
So it's worth it,
It's worth it.
but do your
But
research.
do your research.
Okay, so here's something to think about. As
Okay.
you're doing that research,
Mm-hmm.
everyone's talking about, more density
Yeah.
or community-focused living.
Yeah.
How do you think, like, Laneway homes in West Van can kind of contribute to that?
Ooh, that's a good question.
How can they be innovative? How can they, really make a difference?
Right.
So that's something to think about as you're going through all this.
It is. It's an exciting time for laneway homes.
It is, for sure.
Lots of possibility.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive.
Bye.
Bye.